Okay, last bit. What could we possibly be guilty of? It's an awkward question. Putting aside when we may or may not have helped start or place into a democracy a leader that we may have liked a little bit more than someone else. Again, leaving that aside. The other things that fall under the ICC jurisdiction: military operations and alleged war crimes. Iraq War 2003, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, conducted without explicit UN Security Council authorization, has been criticized by some legal scholars as a potential violation of international law, particularly the prohibition on the crime of aggression under the Rome Statute. While the ICC has limited jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, the U.S. could theoretically face scrutiny if it were a party to the Rome Statute. Treatment of detainees during the Iraq War and the broader war on terror, the U.S. faced allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including the use of torture at Abu Ghraib prison and Guantanamo Bay, and extraordinary renditions. These actions could fall under the ICC's jurisdiction if the U.S. were a party of the Rome Statute. Drone strikes and civilian casualties. The U.S. drone program, particularly countries like Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, have been criticized for causing civilian casualties and violating international humanitarian law. Some legal experts argue that certain strikes could constitute war crimes if they disproportionately harm civilians or fail to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Support for allies accused of war crimes. The U.S. has provided military and political support to allies accused of actions that could fall under the Rome Statute. For example, Israel. The U.S. has consistently supported Israel, including during conflicts in Gaza, where allegations of war crimes have been made by human rights organizations. Saudi Arabia. The U.S. has supported Saudi Arabia's military campaign in Yemen, which has been accused of causing widespread civilian casualties and potentially violating international humanitarian law. Refusal to cooperate with the ICC. The U.S. has actively opposed the ICC's jurisdiction over its citizens and allies. In 2002, Congress passed the American Service Members Protection Act, ASPA, which authorizes the use of force to free U.S. personnel detained by the ICC and prohibits U.S. cooperation with the court. This law has been nicknamed the Hague Invasion Act because of its extreme measures. In 2020, the Trump administration imposed sanctions on ICC officials investigating alleged U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan and Israeli actions in Palestine. These sanctions were later lifted by the Biden administration, but the U.S. continues to reject the ICC's jurisdiction over its citizens. Afghanistan and alleged war crimes. The ICC has investigated alleged war crimes committed by the U.S. forces, the CIA, and the Taliban in Afghanistan. While the ICC ultimately decided to deprioritize the investigation in 2021, the allegations included torture and abuse of detainees, civilian casualties from military operations. The U.S. has refused to cooperate with the ICC's investigation, arguing it has its own legal mechanisms to address such allegations. Use of cluster munitions and landmines. The U.S. has used cluster munitions in conflicts such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen, which have been criticized for causing disproportionate harm to civilians. While the U.S. is not party to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, their use could be seen as a violation of international humanitarian law and potentially a war crime under the Rome Statute. Guantanamo Bay and detention without trial. The detention of individuals at Guantanamo Bay without trial, along with allegations of torture and inhumane treatment, has been widely criticized as a violation of international law. These actions could potentially constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute. Opposition to the ICC's jurisdiction over allies. The U.S. has lobbied aggressively to prevent the ICC from investigating its allies, particularly Israel. For example, the U.S. has opposed the ICC's investigation into alleged war crimes in the Palestinian territories, arguing that the court lacks jurisdiction because Palestine is not a sovereign state. The U.S. has consistently argued that it has its own robust legal system to address allegations of war crimes and human rights abuses, making ICC jurisdiction unnecessary. However, critics argue that the U.S. has not always held its personnel accountable, particularly in cases involving high-ranking officials or sensitive national security matters. While the U.S. is not bound by the Rome Statute, its actions in conflicts such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and the War on Terror, have raised questions about compliance with the international humanitarian law. The ICC's ability to investigate these actions is limited by the U.S.'s non-participation in the court, its active opposition to the ICC's jurisdiction. Nonetheless, these actions have been criticized by human rights organizations and legal experts as potentially inconsistent with the principles enshrined in the Rome Statute. So that's why we're not part of it. Let alone now what is happening to the people under its own jurisdiction. I wonder if they'll investigate that by their own, its own robust legal system to address allegations of human right abuses.